there. I just wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about the homeschool timeline. A timeline is a really useful tool that you can use to bring together the information that you're learning through living books. Because with the Peaceful Press, we don't use a dry, tedious textbook. We teach through beautiful stories and beautiful living books. Often we can wonder, oh, will there be holes and will they know how to connect it? But a timeline can be really helpful with that because what the timeline does is it helps us see when things happened and how they fit together. If you're reading the Little House on the Prairie book, and then at the same time you're reading a book about the railroad, you can make a timeline card for Laura and Mary arriving in Silver Lake. And you can also make a timeline card for when the first transcontinental railroad was finished. So, making these timeline cards can really help us connect activities for our children. The Peaceful Press offers timeline cards. They are simple blank cards with a date and a name on them, and you just draw pictures. And it's a really fun activity. Every week, maybe once a week, pull out the timeline cards. And while you're reading out loud, your children can draw pictures to depict some of the activities. Or you can even draw the pictures with your children. I have timeline cards that were drawn by grandparents and by myself and by my children, and even some of my adult children have contributed to our timeline cards. So that's one way of keeping a timeline, is just drawing a picture to depict the activity. And then we hang them in our school area on a chalkboard. We just put a string across the top of the chalkboard and hang those timeline cards up in chronological order. Some people keep something called a book of centuries, and this could be any blank sketchbook. And you basically number each page. You could number it by 10 years, by 20 years, by 100 years. And so you number the pages, and then on the pages, you just add events. And you can draw little pictures, you can write a little note about it. But this book of the centuries becomes an incredible keepsake of your homeschool years, as every week your child enters some new information into their book of centuries. You could even glue those Peaceful Press timeline cards into it, or shrink the timeline cards down and maybe add 4 to a page in your timeline book. Another timeline idea is the century chart. So the century chart is basically a grid with 100 spaces on it. It represents 1 century or 100 years. And in each of those spaces, and you don't even have to fill them all in, you could write an event. So for instance, if I was doing the 1900s in around 1917, 1918, I might add something about World War One. In the late 30s, early 40s, I could add some information or some dates about World War Two. I could draw a picture in the boxes that represent the 30s about the Great Depression, or I could add some of the stories we've read and the settings they were in on that century chart. But on the century chart, I could also add the date I got married, or the date I was born, or the date my parents were born. So a century chart, especially if it's a century chart in your lifetime, can be this amazing keepsake, not only of what you've learned about places around the world and about people, but it can also be a place where you start to record your own history. And we include a century chart in some of our student sheets, most particularly the Kind Kingdom. But you can use any century chart or any grid with 100 spaces to create your own based on what kind of curriculum you're using. Another timeline is just a personal timeline. I've made a personal timeline about how many Wild and Free conferences I've been to, or a personal timeline about how many Love After Marriage conferences I've been to, because these personal timelines help us kind of track some of our growth or some of the special events that we've been involved in. Another way to create a personal timeline that's helpful is just creating a personal timeline of significant events in your life. When did you get married? What were the experiences of your childhood and important dates? When were you baptized, or when did you learn to read, or when did you graduate from high school? So a personal timeline could be significant events in your life, trips that you've taken, or when you had your first child. This could be done in a sketchbook, on a piece of paper, in your journal, just in any way. Making a record of your life and of the things that you've experienced in your life can be a precious keepsake to hand down to your children, but can also help you be more self-aware. And then the last kind of timeline is the trauma egg. And the trauma egg is something that psychologists use to help identify some of the trauma in a person's life as they're working through it and as they're trying to find out some of their attachment issues. So you can draw an egg picture and just on there start listing out some of the things that have happened to you that have been hard. I'll link a trauma egg exercise in the notes, but it's just a way of identifying, like, oh, I have a struggle with feeling alone as an adult or feeling afraid as an adult. And here are some events from childhood that may have made me believe this lie instead of believing the truth that God is watching out for me. So, those are a few different kinds of timelines. I'm going to link a blog post that talks more about them, as well as where you can find the Peaceful Press timeline cards. Thanks for watching.